What's up, guys? Just wanted to share my 2 cents on why we have so much tension with China. What is the origin of the fractured and complicated dynamic and relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China, as it's ironically named? So, to give a lot of context, most of these tensions relate back to what China likes to call the century of humiliation. There's a time when, roughly from 1840 until 1940, when China was forcibly open to imperialism, mainly by Great Britain. Great Britain's government, or better said, factions of Great Britain's government that were overseeing its foreign policy and its economic endeavors, they smuggled opium into China to make the Chinese population reliant on British goods. This resulted in what was called the Opium War, and the UK acquired Hong Kong and established unfair economic conditions throughout all of China. This then directly contributed to China's loss of Taiwan. They lost it to Japan in 1895, in which there was then the Chinese Civil War following Japan's invasion of China, World War II. From the perspective of China, they'd been on top of the world for centuries, and then these last 200 years have been a fluke in world history, where the West has dominated simply because China was not on its A game. China's rise to power from their point of view is a return to the historical status quo. A lot of the tensions today between the US and China relate specifically to Taiwan. It's where there is a very vulnerable potential collision point. And what we need to understand about Taiwan is that for centuries, it had more or less been part of China, though historical accounts differ. Suffice it to say that when the Ming Dynasty collapsed in 1644, Taiwan at that time was partially under the dominion of the Dutch. A large number of Ming refugees and elements of the former government fled to Taiwan in 1661 with the hope of one day reconquering the mainland and reinstituting the Ming Dynasty. So this component, this isolated faction of the Ming, they ruled Taiwan until 1683, when eventually the Qing, the new dynasty, invaded the island, bringing it under their control. The Qing dynasty was the last dynasty of China, and they lost Taiwan to Japan in 1895 during the Sino-Japanese War. The Japanese, having recently modernized and westernized to some capacity, they were able to remain free of Western colonization and imperialism. However, part of the side effect of this was that they cultivated their own desire to colonize their neighbors and increase their economic standing and power. So they fought a war with the Qing, mostly in Korea, actually, and the result was that the Qing were decimated and had to agree to a humiliating treaty in which they gave up all of Taiwan and much of their sphere of influence in Korea, allowing Japan to expand to the borders of Manchuria. And so Japan began its occupation of Taiwan. And in truth, the people that were living on Taiwan had never been particularly fond of the Qing. So getting new management and a form of much more competent rule from a modern nation to them was honestly a breath of fresh air. Japanese rule modernized the island tremendously and set a strong foundation for its political institutions and economic development. The Japanese instituted several policies that changed the identity of the island and have put it in a unique cultural and economic position. And the result is that Taiwan today is more of an economic powerhouse. It still has some nostalgic connections to Japanese rule. And this has led to it having an even further cultural shift away from mainland China, much to the Communist Party's dismay. The Japanese language was forced on the population through the education system, and this led to Taiwan's literacy rate becoming greater than that of mainland China. Taiwan's economy fared very well. The Taiwanese were better fed than mainland China, and there was even limited forms of democratic rule, which were open to small segments of the population. There were a number of negative policies that the Japanese implemented. For one, relations between the indigenous people of Taiwan and the Japanese government were terrible. The Japanese routinely conducted ethnic cleansing operations on the natives, which they encouraged the natives or coerced them to fight amongst themselves. And then they even used chemical and biological weapons on them, which set the stage for repeated horrific incidents that occurred during World War II. And the Japanese also utilized Taiwan to grow and smuggle opium and even cocaine into mainland China, further prolonging and contributing directly to what the communist government labels as the century of humiliation. Though rule over Taiwan was not benevolent, it was extremely efficient. And this efficiency was deeply missed when the Kuomintang came to power in Taiwan after World War II. The Taiwanese people had developed a sort of Stockholm syndrome for Japan's rule, in a way that really parallels the relationship between the Philippines and the United States. In the same way that the Japanese occupation of the Philippines endeared the Filipinos to their former occupiers, the United States, the Kuomintang's presence did the same for the Taiwanese, who grew to miss the Japanese. So, during all the time when mainland China was falling apart at the seams, Taiwan was under peaceful and economically stable dominion. At this time, eventually, the Kuomintang briefly held dominion over mainland China. And to explain a little bit about the Kuomintang, what we need to understand is that their goal was to enact martial law or military rule for a limited period, educate the Chinese people in the rule of democracy and the rule of law, eventually have the military step down from power, and then bring forth the institution of full-fledged democracy. However, civil war continued within mainland China, and the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, was established in 1921. This war continued for forever. In truth, it hasn't ended. And the KMT, the Kuomintang, were on the brink of wiping the CCP and Mao Zedong, or as I like to call him, Satan's boyfriend. They were about to wipe them off the face of the earth when Japan invaded mainland China. And the leader of the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek, he was forced to team up with the CCP to fend off the Japanese. In an event that is known as the Xi'an Incident, one of Chiang Kai-shek's generals was being insubordinate and was not launching the attack to wipe the commies from the face of the earth. So Chiang Kai-shek met with his general, and that general put him under house arrest and said that he would not defeat the communists. He said they needed to team up with them to fight their common enemy, the Japanese. And Chiang Kai-shek himself had even attended military school in Japan. Such was the only way to learn of the modern military dynamics and the Western strategies. And he cited that though the Japanese were a grave threat, that they were a cancer of the brain, while the Japanese were merely an enemy that could be dealt with later. Chiang Kai-shek had no choice. His life was on the line in this case. So, much to his dismay, he listened to his generals and they teamed up with the CCP. Long story short, the Japanese were defeated and the Chinese Civil War immediately resumed thereafter. Part of the U.S. agreement with the Kuomintang was that following Japan's defeat, all colonial holdings, including Taiwan, would be handed back to China once Japan was defeated. So, after 50 years of Japanese rule, Taiwan became part of China again. The KMT arrived, and in the early days, they were not very good at ruling the island. In their defense, though, governing Taiwan was probably not a huge priority yet for them at the beginning, since they were focused on defeating the CCP in mainland China. Well, in the same way that the Ming Dynasty ran away to Taiwan during the rise of the Qing, the KMT ran away to Taiwan with the rise of the CCP. Eventually reached the point where Chiang Kai-shek had no choice but to abandon mainland China. The CCP, and in truth, Mao Zedong, had triumphed. The People's Republic of China was established in 1949, with the CCP holding totalitarian control over all of mainland China, and they vowed to take back Taiwan. The U.S. government and their lobbyists from Taiwan were very disappointed that Chiang Kai-shek had lost, despite all the aid we had given him through World War II. Tons of money, tons of weapons. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Wow. History sure has a tendency to rhyme. The Truman administration decided after Chiang Kai-shek's failures that they were going to let the CCP invade Taiwan if they wanted to. However, the Korean War changed everything. In the same way that the Japanese invasion of China saved the CCP from being annihilated, North Korea's invasion of South Korea saved the KMT, the Kuomintang, from being abandoned by the USA. At the end of World War II, Korea, having been a Japanese colony for 40 years, so less time than Taiwan had been, Korea was divided between the US and the Soviet Union. With Cold War tensions, the two states were established, but both Korean states and the Korean people longed for unification, and they were extremely polarized and divided amongst themselves. 40 years of brutal oppression had laid the seeds, sowed the seeds of a fratricidal conflict that erupted. Honestly, it had been going on in some form for years by the time North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950. But that was the official instigation of what the world has come to cite as the beginning of the Korean War. You really go down the rabbit hole in that whole conflict, and I encourage you to. It's fascinating. While the Korean War was a civil war, the US and its capitalist allies did not perceive it that way. They viewed it as predominantly as an interstate war that they believed could have been the Soviet Union's first step in launching a worldwide conflict. They thought that North Korea's aggression was the equivalent of Hitler's first aggressive moves in Europe from a few years prior. President Harry Truman committed U.S. ground forces to aid South Korea's anti-communist government. And with regards to China, President Truman commanded the U.S. Navy to assume a position between mainland China and Taiwan to deter communist aggression there as well. Harry Truman also asked the United Nations, which had been newly established, to condemn North Korea's invasion and defend South Korea. By 1950, the UN still embodied a globe mainly dominated by the influence and interests of the Western world. Only by the 1950s and 1960s, with the addition of former colonized territories, did the UN become less Western dominated and also much less efficient. The CCP, led by Mao Zedong, lacked representation in the UN at this time. The KMT, led by Chiang Kai-shek, occupied China's seat in the United Nations Security Council. Chiang Kai-shek, of course, opposed communist aggression in Korea because he feared Taiwan could also become the victim of communist aggression. He even offered his own ground troops to support South Korea. The U.S. declined his offer, but an international coalition did aid South Korea's government. This helped the U.S. and the KMT become allies once again. In truth, Chiang was hoping he could instigate a war between the United States and the CCP, which would allow him to return to the mainland as China's rightful ruler. Mao Zedong perceived the presence of the U.S. fleet in the Taiwan Strait already as an act of war. And given the CCP's lack of representation in the UN, he had no qualms with fighting an open war against UN forces in Korea. In the eyes of the CCP, which was clearly dominated by Mao Zedong, this was not a war against a legitimate international coalition. The UN merely embodied a new era of Western imperialists that threatened China's territory, sphere of influence, and sovereignty. In fact, such an army was already assembled. Since he could no longer use his army to invade Taiwan and kill the KMT, he diverted his army to Korea instead, armed with Western weaponry that they'd acquired from the fleeing KMT and the surrendering KMT. Sadly, the U.S. greatly miscalculated the CCP's resolve, and General MacArthur's foolish strategic decisions resulted in the U.S. being completely overwhelmed by the Chinese ground forces, and we had to retreat back to South Korea. History is, in truth, the unfolding of miscalculations. If any faction really won the Korean War, it was probably the Chinese, communist and capitalist. Mao judged that maintaining a sphere of influence in Korea was more important than taking Taiwan, at least for the time being. Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT found themselves back under U.S. protection, and the U.S. and Taiwan signed a defense treaty in 1955. The U.S. sort of won. We kept communism out of South Korea, but alas, we failed to unite the Korean peninsula, and we were so dang close. If anyone really lost the Korean War, it was, of course, the Koreans themselves, forever divided until we defeat China anyway. North Korea is mostly just a symptom of the larger problem, that, of course, being the CCP. Well, you might ask, how is it that the United States had a defense treaty with Taiwan, and then within 25 years, everything changed? How could this be? What happened between 1955 and 1980 was Washington, D.C. at perhaps its worst performance, which is really saying something. The CCP and the Soviet Union, China and the Soviet Union, despite being communist, were not the best of allies. Gradually, U.S. politicians thought we could get on the CCP's good side to team up against the Soviet Union. in the Cold War. We did so, but at tremendous cost. At the cost of Taiwan, and at the cost of building up our worst enemy. While China is certainly a big nation and a force to be reckoned with, it makes sense that we couldn't just ignore them diplomatically. However, China insisted that if we were to recognize them diplomatically, we would need to cut off our ties to Taiwan. The US might have been more inclined to do so because Taiwan's performance under the KMT had been meh in the early days. Only when the KMT realized they had nowhere to go did they really get their act together and govern Taiwan much more competently. And while they ruled it competently, they did so at the cost of freedom. The KMT ruled Taiwan as an authoritarian institution. They were not democratic. However, they were not totalitarian. They never enforced the one-child policy. They never banned religion. It's much like Korea. You can look at the two factions, especially during the height of the Cold War. Yes, they both had immense problems, but look at where things have turned out now. Can anyone really dispute that South Korea went on to become a better place than the North? In addition, I might add that the institution of martial law in both Korea and Taiwan had legitimacy, given that in Korea, the Korean War erupted and never ended. It's only on pause. And same with mainland China and Taiwan. Given that China seemed it could have invaded at any time, the implementation of martial law made sense. Ultimately, President Nixon vowed not to sell Taiwan down the river, and that's exactly what he did. He visited China, met with Mao Zedong, and the US and China agreed to a number of confusing statements. And these are found within the Shanghai Communique, in which the official statement says, the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. The United States government does not challenge that position. It reaffirms its interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves. We acknowledged China's claims to Taiwan, but we did not accept them. That's what it says in English, the canonical version of this document. However, in the Chinese version, in the Mandarin version, it's translated as saying that the United States accepts China's claims. Pretty different. In 1979, the U.S. recognition of Taiwan as the government of China switched to Beijing. What we did to Taiwan would have been the equivalent of if President Trump had cut off our ties to South Korea after meeting with Kim Jong-un. How would the world have reacted if he had done that? He was already getting flack for anything. Imagine if he'd actually done something terrible like that. If anyone had told Chiang Kai-shek in 1945, heck, in 1955, that a U.S. president would be chumming it up with his arch nemesis Mao Zedong in his lifetime, he never would have believed them. Truth is stranger than fiction. Thankfully, for once, Congress got its act together and approved a crucial piece of legislation that has salvaged the damage done by Nixon and Jimmy Carter. And while you could argue that this isn't the most charitable of moves by Congress, that it is mostly motivated by lobbying, which, let's be real, it probably is, it at least makes sense, unlike some other decisions that Congress has a tendency to make. The Taiwan Relations Act was passed by Congress, And it ensures that we maintain some form of diplomatic relations with Taiwan, and we keep selling them weapons to deter CCP aggression. The CCP was absolutely infuriated by this. They thought they'd finally gotten the agreement they wanted, and here the US was changing the agreement. And frankly, we did change the agreement. However, since Jimmy Carter was not a great president and historically unpopular at that time, if he had vetoed this law, Congress would have overturned his veto and it would have been implemented regardless. That's how democracy works. Rule by the people. But China could not understand how Carter let the Taiwan Relations Act come about. What do you mean, rule by the people? To them, they tell the people what to think. But that's the difference with our governing systems. Thus, the United States and China find themselves in a delicately balanced situation. And the United States government, or components of our government, whoever was leading our foreign policy, which obviously have not the best track record, they concluded that perhaps we could change China through economics. Maybe if we traded with them extensively and they became capitalist, then surely democracy would follow. Well, this might have been an initially smart idea, but somehow the US government continued to stupidly drink this Kool-Aid for decades longer than it should have. And this was demonstrated most clearly when Taiwan chose to reform and the CCP made similar reform impossible. In truth, this more or less happened in Korea as well. Both backed US governments recognized that they needed to reform their governing system. Taiwan realized that if it wanted to earn more legitimacy internationally, it would need to democratize. Therefore, in the 1980s and 90s, Taiwan's military government stepped down, and Taiwan has been a democracy ever since. And they haven't had any odd flare-ups or attempts at martial law. South Korea was on this track for a bit, but in recent months, unfortunately, threw that track record out the window. Taiwan becoming democratic made it much more popular internationally, especially when Beijing proved that similar changes were impossible. The Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989 should have made it plain to see that China would never change of its own will. Despite this clear indication that China would never abandon totalitarianism, we continued for decades to invest in China economically with the vain hope that they would change. And as General Shepard said in Modern Warfare 2, the more things change, the more they stay the same. China developed its military and now is a great threat to Taiwan. Any fool that thought we could make them become our friend the way that Japan became our friend, they seem to have forgotten that we had to nuke Japan twice and reprogram them before they became our ally. For all intents and purposes, you could argue that Japan is effectively almost a colony of the United States. We still have untold numbers of US troops over there. And now we bring this back. Sure, the politics is all flowery and all dramatic, but we do need to recognize that money and lobbying play a pivotal role in global politics. And that's where this is of utmost importance as well. And it also points to the hypocrisy of China threatening Taiwan politically. China's economy profited directly from Taiwan's input. When China became capitalist, a number of Taiwanese folks traveled to the mainland and contributed directly to China's economic growth, allowing China to catch up with Taiwan. The Taiwanese who were living in the future, so to speak, due to economic development, went to mainland China, which was decades behind thanks to communism. And there was no language barrier. They could seamlessly establish companies there and help them progress. Mainland China even gave Taiwan a fresh economic start, or second chance, so to speak. Yet despite China benefiting directly from Taiwan's contribution to its economic growth, they still behave aggressively towards Taiwan, which I think is frankly despicable. And Taiwan also, guided by the foresight of its government, realized that semiconductors and microchips would be of utmost importance in the global economy. And through companies like TSMC, Taiwan has made themselves the center of the global supply chain of semiconductors and microchips. Every smartphone, every laptop, even our weapon systems are dependent on these microchips. And only the Taiwanese can create them, or they can create the best ones by far. And that has made them a much more tempting target for the CCP. If the CCP could gain that monopoly, the means of production, then they would be projected into the future and be the world's top power without a doubt. The KMT understood that you can trust the Communist Party about as much as you can trust an American to be literate in Mandarin Chinese. So, the CCP established one country, two systems in Hong Kong when the UK gave Hong Kong back to China. And in a show of good faith, somehow the Chinese believed that if they didn't screw that up, then surely Taiwan would be more inclined to join them. Because we all know how one country, two systems worked out. It worked out great, right? Wrong! Now one country, two systems has become a complete meme. While everyone hopes that Korea can be unified, we know that's impossible without the fall of China and North Korea. The same is true of Taiwan and China. If China would just abandon its pride and its ego and adopt democratic values, then Taiwan would be perfectly content to be part of China. Or, even if they still don't want to be part of China, they could be friends. How do we know this? Look at the relationship between the United States and Great Britain. We were their colony. We fought a war to break free from them. However, over time, because we're composed of many of the same people, we speak the same language, and we have similar government ideals and principles, we become very close allies. You could even argue that some of that is selfish in nature. The US and Great Britain more or less agreed to team up and defend their empires. That's exactly what Taiwan and China could be. But China has stupidly made the issue non-negotiable. They have manipulated their entire population into believing that the century of humiliation will only end when Taiwan is back in their grasp. And something we need to keep in mind is often we might say that China's government manipulates and brainwashes their population, but we must remember that their government are the most brainwashed of them all. That is why the only thing China will understand and the only way we can prevent conflict is through strength and deterrence. And I dare say this, that Taiwan is back in China's grasp. It's in the hands of the signatories of the World War II armistice, the Kuomintang, the rightful representation of what China should be on the world stage. The humiliation will only continue so long as the CCP is in power. We also need to keep in mind that if it weren't for the century of humiliation, there's no way that the CCP would have taken power. Much like how the nation of Israel would not exist if the Holocaust never happened. And if the US fails to defend Taiwan, we will lose all credibility on the world stage. South Korea and Japan will no longer trust us to hold to our defense agreements. And with the economic factor, we can't afford to let a totalitarian regime gain the means of production on microchips.